better daily, where we work hard in our minds, bodies, and our spirits to become 1% better every single day. Download the app and join our Betterment family at betterdaily.live to catch the video version of these podcasts. Here's your host and my dad, Alex Van Houten.
What is up, Betterment family? This is Alex Van Houten in Better Daily Live. Happy Thursday. It's Word Thursday, which means we get to go through a word that I've been meditating on, and I'm very excited to share with you this week's word. The word is Schadenfreude. Yes, Schadenfreude is a word, and I'm excited to bring it to you today. Schadenfreude is actually a word for an emotion. The word is a German word. It's the combination of Schade. I'm probably saying that wrong because I'm not very well versed in German, but I do know this word well. Schade and Freude. Schade is harm, if I'm not terribly mistaken, and Freude is joy. And the combination of the two words, Schadenfreude, describes an emotion that we feel when we feel pleasure or joy in relationship to somebody else's misfortune. And it's a very, very well studied emotion. It's something that is more widely understood and accepted in other cultures than in English, and that's why we don't have a word for it in English at all. This emotion's a really important emotion because, well, in the psychological literature, there are many reasons to study it and many reasons that we feel it. So I'm gonna describe to you a scenario. I promise you felt Schadenfreude before. You just might not know the word for it. So here it is. So let's say you are with a friend and you're walking along and they trip and fall. And your immediate reaction to them tripping and falling is to giggle a little bit or laugh before you're like, are you okay? Now, admittedly, this happens much more often in men than in women. And in fact, the psychological literature bears that out. It's much more common for men to feel Schadenfreude than it is for women to feel Schadenfreude. But it's that feeling of somebody experiences misfortune and then you have an immediate activation of your pleasure or reward center of the brain. And it's involuntary. You don't get to make this decision in the moment. So it's a laugh, right? So how about I describe it this way? Because it's related to a bunch of different things, right? It's not just somebody else experiences pain or does something silly and then you laugh. It's also related to a few other things. So here's an interesting fact about Schadenfreude. If you feel that the person was in the wrong and then they experience misfortune, you're more likely to experience Schadenfreude. This happened to me recently. I was driving on the highway. Some crazy person sped by me, like going way too fast. You know, I'm going 5 over the speed limit. They're going like 25 over the speed limit. And then they get pulled over and I'm driving up to them. They get pulled over about 5 minutes ahead of me and I see them and I'm like, haha, that's what you get. That's Schadenfreude, where you're like, haha, like that's how things are supposed to work. You deserve that, haha, you know, because they might be having a really bad day. Who knows why they were speeding? It could be some punk kid in a car way more expensive than they should probably be able to afford, blowing by everybody way faster than they should, putting everybody at risk. And yeah, you should get pulled over for that. But it could also be that they're racing home in order to deal with a sick relative, or maybe they're trying to be at the hospital for a procedure for somebody, or the classic, like, there's a woman in the passenger seat about to give birth to a baby and they're really trying to hightail it to the hospital, right? And psychology, that actually also has a name. It's called the fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error is the tendency for humans, when we make a mistake, there's a number of reasons. We have compassion for that mistake. I made that mistake because X, Y, Z, right? But when somebody else makes a mistake, it's because they're a terrible person. That's called the fundamental attribution error. When we make a mistake, we attribute it to the circumstances that created the situation. Whereas when other people make a mistake, our knee-jerk response is that they are a bad person, not necessarily that there are circumstances that may or may not have contributed to them making that mistake. And the fundamental attribution error is actually a deep part of Schadenfreude. Some of the reason that you might experience pleasure in somebody else's discomfort or pain or misfortune is that you don't understand everything that went into their misfortune. Here's the classic example. So let's say you have, and you see this a lot in TV, television's full of Schadenfreude. A lot of the shows you probably love, especially if they're comedies, there's a lot of Schadenfreude involved. I just watched The Office with my wife not that long ago, and The Office has lots and lots of Schadenfreude. Whether or not the people deserve it, there's a bunch of misfortune, and we generally get a giggle out of people's calamities and whatnot. But that classic example in The Office or Office Space is kind of the jerk boss, you know, who has an undeserved managerial position, and they're kind of throwing their weight around a little bit, and then they spill coffee on themselves or something, and you're like, haha, that's what you get for, you know, being a jerk boss, right? But if you spilled coffee on yourself, that'd be rough, right? You'd be like, oh man, like I don't have a change of clothes. I've got coffee on me. I have an important meeting coming up. Like this is terrible. If anybody laughs at me, they're terrible people too. And that's the interesting thing about Schadenfreude. Schadenfreude is common among people. So if you feel it, it's not like you're a worse person than anybody else, but it is an opportunity to reflect a bit on yourself and your level of compassion for other people and your level of compassion for yourself, because it turns out the more compassionate you are, the less Schadenfreude you feel. From a personality perspective, you're less likely to take pleasure in the misfortune of others, because when you see misfortune, you immediately feel what that misfortune would feel like if you were in their shoes, not just from the outside looking in. Turns out that the dark triad types, the Machiavellian psychopaths, they experience Schadenfreude way more often and way more intensely than the average person. So if you're extremely low in compassion, it's much easier for you to laugh at somebody else's misfortune because you don't feel the pain associated with it. And then there's one other thing that I found interesting in the Schadenfreude literature of late, and that is the relationship with self-esteem. So something else that was very interesting in the psychological literature about Schadenfreude is that Schadenfreude, the amount of Schadenfreude you feel, how intensely it lights up your pleasure centers in your brain and whatnot. In the research, the lower your self-esteem, like the lower you think about yourself, the more often you experience Schadenfreude. Whereas the higher your self-esteem, the higher you think of yourself, the less often you feel Schadenfreude. The reason this is pertinent, because you'd say, I mean, it's kind of a weird relationship it's a weird relationship. But if you think of Schadenfreude as the tendency to involuntarily enjoy when other people are having a hard time, then you go, let's say it would be great if there was less of that in the world. Wouldn't there? If somebody's having a hard time, rather than laughing at them, it would be better that we were a good neighbor. That's what we're called to be. You know, that's when you look in the mirror, if you've been a good neighbor, you feel a little more at peace with yourself than if you've been enjoying everybody else's misfortune. And I thought this was really interesting because this harkens back to something that we talked about in this group probably 5 or 6 months ago when we were going through the Better Man Challenge. One of the words is intimacy. And in order to have intimate relationships, in order to love other people well, we went back to Jesus's commands. He says the most important commandment in the Bible is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and all your strength. And the second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. And people generally think they know what that means. Like, be nice to people, love other people well, show up well for them, be a good neighbor, like the Good Samaritan, that sort of thing. But there's this really, really interesting relationship, and I like to highlight this, especially in Christian circles, specifically. This idea that if we were to love other people like we love ourselves, then that kind of begs the question about whether or not we love ourselves. And I don't mean like you pamper yourself and get pedicures and think you're the best thing since sliced bread. That's not what love is. Love means that you treat yourself with the respect that you deserve for being a creation of God. You treat yourself with the same regard that he would treat you. And then you treat other people out of the overflow of that regard. And that's part of the 1% better journey, right? Because if you love yourself, if you know that you were put here for a purpose, if you have great potential, that your life has meaning, and that you're making an impact, with the things that you do and how you think and how you speak and whether or not you're eating well for yourself and whether or not you're moving and making the most of your body and whether or not you're getting enough rest and taking the rest that you need in order to show up well and to make the most of what you have right now. If you're doing those things, what's really cool is when you love other people, you will love them at least that well, maybe even better. And that's an interesting thing about Schadenfreude is that in the research, if you start looking at why people take pleasure in other people's pain and what might affect that, right? How often we do that and how infrequently we put ourselves in their shoes and have compassion and do something about terrible situations. When we're more likely to do that, it's an indication that we're not loving ourselves very well. I said this to a group of men recently. I was talking about the vanity of fitness, and we looked at Ephesians 5 because that's the marriage chapter. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. That's pretty intense. Later, though, he says, husbands should love their wives like they love their own bodies. And then Paul says, for no man hated his body. Like, man, maybe not in your time, Paul, but I work with a lot of people who don't have a lot of love for themselves, body, mind, or spirit. And he's speaking about marriage like he takes it for granted that people of the time would be thankful and appreciative and loving of what it is that they have, and that was the springboard by which to love other people. And so my encouragement to you today is this. If Schadenfreude sounds like a terrible thing and you don't want more of it in your life, if you don't want to be the person who fundamentally attributes your pain and to your circumstances, but you look at other people and say, wow, you did something terrible, you're a bad person. If you think that there needs to be less of that in the world, I would encourage you to double down on loving yourself well in this whole 1% better journey. Because if you can have compassion for you, if you can have compassion for where you come from and what you've done and how you fail sometimes, that will, and you can still love yourself. You can be not like, you're a terrible person for doing X, Y, Z, but you know what? Like, hey, you did the best you could today. It wasn't easy, but you showed up. If you're in the position where you could have more peace, more compassion, more love for yourself in this 1% better journey, I promise you, and the psychological literature is very straightforward, I promise you that will show up in your relationships. You're going to put yourself in other people's shoes more often and with less effort on your part to do so. You'll do it more readily, and perhaps you can take pleasure in their betterment rather than their misfortune. And that's my prayer for us as a community, that we'll be the kind of people who celebrate and encourage and support and continue and move forward the good, that will take pleasure in the better of other people. Genuine pleasure in the better of other people. That's my hope. And I don't know what the German word for that is, but around here we're just going to call it better. Guys, this has been Alex Van Houten in Better Daily Live. I appreciate you joining me for Word Thursday. Tomorrow's Flex Friday, and I'm very excited about moving forward on the exercise front with you. But until then, it's just 1%. You got this.
Thank you for joining us for 1% Better today. Don't forget to subscribe for the podcast. Leave us a raving review to tell others how Better Daily has helped you in your journey. If you want more Better Daily, download our app and join our Betterment family at betterdaily.live. Use code POD to get 25% off your subscription. That's POD, all caps, to save 25% on your subscription. We all have a cross to carry. It's later when we do it together. Go to betterdaily.live today.